Welcome to this LinkedIn live chat with Executive Vice President Valdis DOMBROVSKIS, who will talk to us about the economy and the EU's response to the coronavirus crisis.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We will first start with some introductory remarks and we will take your questions afterwards. The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I would like to express EU's solidarity with all the countries, all the people affected by current coronavirus crisis. Also express the admiration of the work what our healthcare workers are currently doing to deal with these pandemics. So first and foremost, we are here dealing with a major public health emergency, but of course it also has substantial implications on our economy because pretty much all EU member states have introduced different restrictions on people movement, on economic activity, on gathering, and already now we see that it's going to have a major negative effect on the economy. So we need to respond in a spirit of solidarity and cooperation. And that's exactly what we have done from the European Commission side in the last weeks. Came with a range of measures, first to ensure the functioning of EU single market, ensuring that goods continue to move in a single market, especially essential goods like medical supplies and food. We have mobilized resources at EU level, so from EU budget, from European Investment Bank through other means, and we have allowed maximum flexibility within EU state aid rules and also fiscal rules so that member states can provide as a response. Also, the European Investment Bank came with a major measures like Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, which helps to ensure that all EU member states have access to financing on favorable terms. So basically what we want to ensure that first of all, we have all the necessary means for a medical response, both in terms of material and financially, and second, to preserve as much as possible our companies and our workers, so provide necessary liquidity to companies, to provide support for workers, to provide support for social programs, because what we want to achieve economically is to preserve productive capacity of our economy as much as possible, preserve our companies, keep to the extent possible people in jobs, so that once the pandemic is over, European economy can quickly recover.
Thank you, Executive Vice President. We have received a few questions on LinkedIn. The first one comes from Ignace. What solidarity has the EU shown towards its member countries, including Italy, Spain and France, which were hard hit by the coronavirus crisis?
Actually, we have acted in multiple directions. First of all, of healthcare response, where we are trying to coordinate the work of the member states. We are organizing joint procurements of medical material, medical supplies, and of course we are seeing lots of solidarity among EU member states. To give an example, for example, Germany and France together has provided more masks to Italy than China, even though it's much less advertised. Or Germany is taking patients from northern Italy in this difficult situation. Member states are organizing joint repatriation flights. So there are many examples how this solidarity is working. At the EU level, I already mentioned what we are mobilizing at EU level in terms of EU budget response, so-called Corona Response Investment Initiative, totaling 93 billion euros. Just yesterday we put forward new measures, so-called SURE program, which is there to support short-term work schemes and similar schemes in member states, so that member states can help companies to keep their workers at work part-time, maybe maybe even idling, but in any case that they are not losing jobs. And EU will provide financing of up to 100 billion euros for those member states, so that member states can actually finance those programs. Also, just yesterday, we decided to provide maximum flexibility for still available EU funds, which are still available in this year's EU budget, which is the last year of current multi-annual financial framework. So maximum flexibility so that member states can use it to crisis response, medical response, support of companies, social programs, and also 100% EU financing, so that member states can use their national funds for other programs, and EU funds will be available with 100 EU financing. There are other programs which I could mention. Work is continuing currently. Just today, for example, the board of European Investment Bank is meeting to discuss a new program which will allow to provide 200 billion euros of loans to European companies and SMEs, which will be much needed to sustain the activity, also for economic recovery. We continue to work on the support through the European Stability Mechanism. We think it should be used in the current circumstances because it has the paid-in capital of member states. It has lending capacity, so we should be using to finance member states on favorable terms, and we are looking in other policy options.
Next question is from Fran. Are there plans to establish EU protocols and guidelines for future similar problems, both to avoid financial hardship to families and to avoid power-grabbing moves by EU leaders?
Well, indeed, of course, there are lessons from this crisis, and already now we are not working only on crisis response, but also on the economic recovery and on different aspects. For example, how we can strengthen the readiness of EU to pandemics or other health emergencies, because so far the competences of EU in the area of healthcare have been actually quite limited. But I think this pandemic clearly shows that we should be doing more together. So becoming proposals how to strengthen actually EU competence in the area of healthcare. There are a number of financing schemes which will be able to evaluate and see what are the positive elements which can stay there after the pandemics. And indeed, we also need to look at the rule of law issues. There are concerns regarding some member states, and currently also the Commission is looking at this situation, because it's clearly that we should not use the pandemics as a way also to undermine rule of law.
The next question comes from Christina. How long will the Green Deal be delayed? Will this crisis affect, in a way, its implementation?
Well, our intention is not to delay the Green Deal. Our goal of climate neutrality by 2050 remains valid. Our Paris commitments for 2030 remain valid. There, of course, may be some adjustments on concrete steps we'll be taking in coming years, but the goals of the Green Deal, as well as the goals of Europe's digital transformation remain there. So when we'll be now working on economic recovery, on, so to say, exit from the crisis, we'll be looking also how to integrate the Green Deal and digital transformation in this work.
We have a question from Jack on LinkedIn, who asks if other plans like the architecture for the euro and making the bank sector resilient through capital reforms will be dropped because of the crisis.
Well, first of all, banking sector is now much more resilient than it was during the global financial and economical crisis a decade ago. Banks have much stronger capital buffers, liquidity buffers. So, and as we see, currently also the economic problems do not come from financial sector as it used to be during the global financial economical crisis. They come from the restrictions in imposed by countries to respond to healthcare emergency. So nature of the economical crisis is very difficult. But this, of course, allows also now certain room of maneuver in terms of capital requirements. For example, we're working with supervisors and regulators, lifting, for example, countercyclical capital buffers, because exactly during the crisis is when you are meant to use. A Basel Committee, which is setting up banking standards internationally, has agreed to delay the implementation of Basel standards by 1 year, and in the EU will be following it up accordingly. So the aim currently is to ensure that banks can use their capital and liquidity to the extent possible actually to finance the real economy, because what we need now is a finance of real economy, so we need to facilitate that banks are actually able to do so.
We have now Consuelo, who on LinkedIn mentioned that he agrees with Mario Draghi's stance on Corona bonds, and his question is, what is your take on that?
Well, as regards Corona bonds, as I was mentioning, we will be exploring all policy options, all possible responses. And maybe Corona bonds are getting lots of headlines, and there is some political controversy around them, but there are actually a number of things which we can do, which we are already doing, which are in pipeline. I was talking about them, and I would also very much underline the next multi-annual financial framework. As President von der Leyen has said, this is going to be our Marshall Plan to finance the economic recovery. Next financial framework is starting next year, so we must ensure that we have ambitious multi-annual financial framework, which is front-loaded, which has strong investment component, so that we can really finance European recovery through a joint EU budget.
The next question is from Michael, who asks, what will be done for SMEs and startups? He's worried that they will be underrepresented in discussions at EU level.
Actually, we are paying a lot of attention to the situation of SMEs and ensuring that SMEs currently receive the support and financing they need to go through this difficult period. Just yesterday, I had a video conference with SME Europe, where we were discussing exactly those matters. So there are number of programs which currently are done at the European level, and I was mentioning the European Investment Bank initiative to have this major 200 billion euros program. There are a number of resources which have been mobilized already now. For example, European Investment Fund in the coming days will be coming with a call for expressions of interests concerning its 8 billion program, which would provide loans to at least 100,000 SMEs. So there are many things which we are doing at European level, and we provided flexibility for member states from state aid point of view to do the same at national level, allowing for different kind of state aid to go to companies, especially SMEs, like direct grants, support, delayed tax payments, financing support, guarantees. So, as I was saying at the beginning, our economic strategy is now to maintain as much as possible productive capacity of European economy, and for this we need to support our companies and SMEs.
We have a question from Norbert. Which countries will receive help?
Well, it depends on different specific instruments. Because broadly speaking, I would say most European countries will be receiving help, but then it depends on a specific situation. When we discuss, for example, help in terms of medical supplies, of course, those are countries which are currently, so to say, at forefront, like Italy and Spain, for example. When we discuss SURE program, it's going to be available to all member states, but of course it will be more interesting for countries which have large short-term work programs and which have more difficult access to finance or more expensive financing costs, because what SURE program will provide is financing at very favorable terms. When we discuss maximum flexibility within the EU funds, it will be mainly cohesion countries who will benefit. So there are different instruments targeted at different countries, but it's clear that most, if not all, countries will be receiving this support.
The next question we have today is from Peter. Will the EU be able to better manage the financial collapse of an EU country? That is, what did we learn from the example of Greece that will make its response better this time?
Well, first of all, this brings us back to the global financial and economical crisis. And indeed, a number of Eurozone countries, starting with Greece, ending in programs. Well, first of all, we already have done a number of things to actually ensure that that kind of crisis is not repeating. We are much better equipped in terms of crisis response tools. We have a European stability mechanism, which is exactly there to provide support to countries in difficulty. European Central Bank is using its monetary policy tools. We can remember Mario Draghi's whatever it takes, which is still there. We have much better coordination of our fiscal and macroeconomic policies than before crisis. We have a banking union which has ensured that banks are in a stronger position, better capitalized than they were during the previous crisis. So lots of lessons have been already learned, and right now one can say that with a response we are providing at EU level, all members fully have access to financial markets.
Next question from Milan. Coronavirus pandemic will be followed by economic recession, not since the Great Depression, which will be followed by other medical emergencies. The question is, how is the EU preparing for this likely scenario?
Well, as regards economic situation, indeed, one can expect recession this year, quite substantial recession. To do exact, macroeconomic forecasting now, it's very difficult because it depends primarily on healthcare situation. So when we'll be dealing with the pandemics, and when member states will be able to start lifting restrictions they have put in their countries, because only then we can expect economic recovery to start. So this is one element. So the longer the lockdowns last, the more damage it creates to the economy. And second is to which extent we will be able to preserve companies, preserve jobs during this period. So those will be the two main factors which will determine our economic recovery, and there we are working to ensure that actually we sustain economic capacity right now, so that this recovery can be as fast as possible. And I will underline once again the importance of next multi-annual financial framework, so the EU budget for next 7 years, which will be important also to provide financing for economic recovery.
Lisa is worried about all the layoffs that are happening right now as a result of the crisis, and she asks, what will happen after the confinement measures are over?
As regards layoffs, that's exactly the point which we think is important to the extent possible to prevent. That's exactly where our SURE program comes in. It's exactly to support member states to finance short-term work programs to minimize the number of layoffs. And from that point of view, the more we preserve jobs, the less there are layoffs, the better economic recovery we'll have after the pandemics.
Nicola's question now. Does the EU have a plan how to help other countries, not only member states, but also potential members? So what is our action with our neighbors?
Well, actually, we are working also with neighboring countries in terms of medical supplies, in terms of a number of other responses, and currently we are also working on what we're calling this coronavirus emergency external response. Exactly looking how with from the EU we can support our neighborhood countries, but how we can also support other countries, for example Africa. So certainly, as you know, EU is actually the biggest international donor as regards development aid, which is provided to other countries, and clearly we will need to provide this support also during this very difficult situation.
We have a question from Yothra now. Will social enterprises receive more financial support from the EU now and in the future? They are on the front line to fight this global crisis.
Well, as regards social enterprises, or I would say also other enterprises, that's exactly was the point, that we want to support our enterprises, including social enterprises right now, as much as possible. And for this, among other things, we have allowed maximum flexibility for the EU funds financing from the EU budget, which member states can use to support businesses, including social enterprises. And we have provided maximum flexibility as regards state aid rules, once again not hampering member states to provide assistance to enterprises.
We have now a question about SURE that you already mentioned from Kruno. SURE loans will contribute to recipient debts, which goes against the Stability and Growth Pact deficit targets and principles. Surely, once the SGP escape clause is finished, the countries will be faced with even larger debt, and the Commission will have to enforce their balanced budget. So the question is, are you kicking the bucket down the road?
Well, first of all, indeed, we have activated so-called general escape clause, which basically at this time removes quantitative targets for member states' budget deficits and public debt. Of course, member states still need to consider their medium-term debt sustainability. And of course we are counting on a situation that after this health emergency, member states will be with much higher budget deficits and correspondingly increased levels of public debt. And once we'll be returning to the, so to say, normal EU fiscal rules, of course we will have to take this into account as a starting position. So it's very clear that where we'll be at end of the this health emergency, once economic recovery will start, will be something we'll have to take into account as a starting position when discussing member states' fiscal policies and already during the phase of recovery.
We now have a question from Arnaud, asking to what extent can we expect the stimulus packages to be in line with the taxonomy regulation on sustainable finance? And how will national governments be encouraged to use the taxonomy criteria when providing aid to businesses?
Well, currently, when we are we introduce so-called temporary framework on state aid, which is providing maximum flexibility to member states. So currently we are not introducing additional requirements, including the requirements linked to the taxonomy. So I would say when we talk now on this crisis response, we need to preserve our economy, we need to preserve jobs, so we cannot now put additional conditions on member states. When we will be dealing with economic recovery, as I was mentioning, we of course stick with our objectives of European Green Deal, and during the phase of economic recovery we want to ensure that this recovery happens in line with the principles of Green Deal, and that's where also EU taxonomy on sustainable economic activities will come in.
I have a question from Valerie now, which says that there is an urgent need for a massive liquidity injection. In a few weeks, some European people won't need any more. Will it be too late?
Well, actually, this liquidity injection is happening already now. And there are multiple ways how it's being done, through the direct support, through EU-level instruments, which I already was mentioning, also through the liquidity which is going to companies through banking sector. Already some time ago, European Central Bank launched so-called TLTRO program, which is to provide liquidity to the banks so that banks can actually finance the real economy. Of course, as we know, in a period of crisis, banks tend to be reluctant to finance economy. That's actually when it's needed most. That's why member states are able to provide guarantees to the banks so that they keep lending to the economy. So this liquidity support is already there. And we are launching a number of new programs through European investment funds. The next one will, as I said, will be in the coming days through the European Investment Bank. So we clearly understand that liquidity is needed now, and we are acting in this very rapid, very urgent fashion.
Merzad asks, what do you think of the employment prospects in the EU? When will we be back to the current situation?
Well, as regards employment prospects, it must be said that we were at the end of long economical cycle, long period of economic growth, and as a result, employment figures before this coronavirus crisis were at historically highest levels. So it's worth noting that in terms of employment, we were at historically highest levels. So now, as I said, our aim is to preserve jobs to the extent possible, so that once health emergency is over, economy can recover and jobs can also gradually recover. So the aim is not to lose jobs to the extent possible.
We have now a question from Bunafsha. How the EU will ensure that all EU countries will be adequately prepared for such a situation in the future? What about a sustainability instrument?
I'm afraid the question is not very clear. Do we refer to fiscal policies or health situation or environmental policies? But as I said, of course, we need to draw lessons in a number of areas in terms of preparedness of our healthcare systems, also in terms of EU role in the area of healthcare, where some reinforcement should be needed. When we discuss economic preparedness, we have the whole toolkit in our disposal, which we are currently using and which should allow to deal even with major economical crisis like this. And if we discuss environmental sustainability, as I was saying, the goals of the Green Deal remain in place.
So we are very closely moving to the end of this session, but I do believe we have still more questions coming in. But I think those will be answered by our social media team after this live chat. So perhaps Executive Vice President would like to do some closing remarks before we finish today.
Well, first of all, I would thank you for organizing this LinkedIn live chat and this possibility to respond to the questions which are currently in people's minds. And I just wanted to reiterate, to deal with this crisis, we need to act as a EU in a spirit of solidarity and coordination. We need to support each other, and together we are able to overcome this crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Executive Vice President, and thank you all for following us on this LinkedIn live chat today. Thank you.